Elias sighed as he adjusted the straps of his thermal gloves, his breath fogging the frosted window of his cabin. Outside, the snowstorm howled like a restless beast, flinging icy tendrils against the wooden walls. He glanced at the clock on the mantel, its ticking the only sound breaking the quiet monotony inside. Another thrilling evening in the life of Elias Harker, he muttered, throwing a log onto the crackling fire. The sparks flared briefly, illuminating the cluttered room, a haven of half-finished inventions, tools, and sketches pinned to the walls. He settled into his worn armchair with a mug of lukewarm coffee, the kind that tasted more like regret than caffeine. The storm outside had trapped him for days, but he was used to solitude. In fact, he preferred it. People were complicated, noisy, and often disappointing. Machines, on the other hand, never lied, never judged. As he sipped his coffee, the sharp sound of a knock at the door shattered his thoughts. Elias froze, staring at the door as though it had grown a mouth and spoken. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. Who in their right mind would be out in this weather? He muttered, setting the mug down. Grabbing a flashlight from the table, he approached the door cautiously. The storm roared louder as he opened it, and for a moment, all he could see was a swirling wall of white. Then, out of the storm, a figure emerged. She stood on the threshold, wrapped in a cloak that shimmered faintly, as though catching light from a source unseen. Her face was pale, almost luminous, framed by dark hair that clung to her cheeks. Her eyes, strikingly bright, almost glowing, met his, and for a moment Elias felt as though the storm had stopped. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge of urgency. Elias blinked, his mind scrambling for an explanation. She didn't look like she belonged in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard. She didn't look like she belonged anywhere, really. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice more curt than he intended. "No," she replied simply, though her tone suggested the question wasn't worth answering. "I require shelter. It is cold." Elias frowned, her odd phrasing not escaping his notice. "Look, I don't usually—" "I will reward you," she interrupted, stepping closer. Snowflakes clung to her cloak but melted before they could touch her skin. "If you let me in." Elias hesitated, the rational part of his mind urging him to shut the door and pretend this encounter never happened, but there was something about her, a mix of vulnerability and quiet command, that made him step aside. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but if you're selling something, I'm not interested." She stepped inside, the storm's fury muffled as he shut the door behind her. The woman stood in the middle of his cluttered living room, her eyes scanning the space with an intensity that made Elias uncomfortable. "Nice place," he said dryly, trying to break the silence. "If you like fire hazards and questionable plumbing." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It is adequate." Elias raised an eyebrow. "High praise. You've got a name?" "Nara," she said after a pause, as though deciding whether he deserved the information. "And you are?" "Elias," he replied, crossing his arms. "So, Nara, what's your deal? You just wander around blizzards offering rewards to strangers?" "I was traveling," she said vaguely, removing her cloak. Beneath it, she wore a fitted jumpsuit that seemed to shimmer like her cloak, its fabric both alien and elegant. The storm was unexpected. "Yeah, it has a habit of doing that," Elias said, watching as she examined his inventions. "Careful with that," he added when she reached for a small contraption on the table. "What is its function?" she asked, tilting her head. "It's a prototype for a thermal regulator," Elias said reluctantly. "Not that it's any of your business." She studied it for a moment before setting it down. Crude, but functional. Elias bristled. "Crude? I spent weeks on that." She didn't respond, instead moving to the fireplace and holding her hands out to the flames. For someone who had just walked out of a storm, she didn't seem particularly cold. Elias leaned against the table watching her. "So, about this reward you mentioned. What is it, gold? Diamonds? A lifetime supply of snow shovels?" Nara turned to him, her expression softening just enough to make her seem less intimidating. It is not something you can measure in human terms, but it is valuable. That's vague, Elias said, narrowing his eyes. You're not some kind of con artist, are you? Because if you are, you picked the wrong cabin. I assure you I am not, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But I understand your skepticism. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, Nara, you can stay until the storm lets up, but no funny business. Agreed, she said, sitting down in the armchair he had vacated. Elias watched her for a moment before shaking his head and heading to the kitchen. He didn't know who or what she was, but one thing was certain. This was going to be the strangest night of his life. Elias wasn't sure what he expected when he let Nara into his cabin, but it wasn't this. She moved through his living room like a queen inspecting her domain, her luminous eyes flitting from one odd contraption to the next. It wasn't just curiosity, though. There was a precision to her gaze, as if she were cataloging every detail. Do you always keep your house like this? She asked, picking up a half-finished circuit board from the cluttered table. Like what? Elias replied, feigning ignorance as he poured water into a kettle. Chaotic. He glanced at the room. Sure, it was messy, but it was his kind of messy, organized chaos. Every tool, wire, and schematic had a place, even if it didn't look that way to an outsider. It's not chaos, he said defensively. It's a system. I know where everything is. Do you? She asked, holding up a wrench with a bent handle. Elias groaned. Okay, maybe not everything, but it works for me. Nara didn't respond, instead placing the wrench back with an almost reverent care. The gesture struck him as odd. Most people would have tossed it back without a second thought, but she handled it like it was something precious. You're not from around here, are you? Elias asked, leaning against the counter. She hesitated, her expression unreadable. Number I am not. That's pretty obvious, he said, gesturing vaguely to her shimmering jumpsuit. So, where are you from? And don't say out of town. Nara tilted her head, considering him. A place far from here, one you would not recognize. Cryptic. Great, Elias muttered, pouring hot water into 2 mugs. Do people where you're from always talk in riddles, or is that just you? A flicker of amusement crossed her face. It is a habit. He handed her a mug, watching as she studied it like it was some alien artifact. It's tea. You drink it, he said, taking a sip of his own. Nara mimicked him, her movements careful and deliberate. She took a small sip, her glowing eyes widening slightly. It is pleasant. Elias chuckled. That's one way to describe it. For a moment the room was quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Elias found himself studying her, trying to piece together the puzzle she presented. Everything about her, from her strange clothing to her formal speech, screamed not normal. So, he said, breaking the silence, what's the deal with that cloak of yours? It looked like it was glowing when you came in. It is a thermal shield, Nara said matter-of-factly. Elias raised an eyebrow. A thermal shield? Like it keeps you warm? Among other things, she replied, taking another sip of tea. Right, he said slowly. And where exactly does one buy a thermal shield? Asking for a friend. Nara's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her. It is not something you can purchase. Figures, Elias muttered, setting his mug down. All right, your turn. Ask me something. She tilted her head. Why do you live here, alone? The question caught him off guard. Most people didn't bother asking. Either they assumed he was a recluse, or they didn't care enough to wonder. I like the quiet, he said after a moment. And it's easier to focus on my work out here. Your work? Elias gestured to the cluttered room. Inventing, tinkering, fixing things that people say can't be fixed. Nara's gaze swept over the room again, her expression thoughtful. You create. I guess you could call it that, he said with a shrug. Not exactly changing the world or anything, though. Perhaps not yet, she said softly. There was something in her tone, an almost wistful quality, that made Elias pause. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but before he could, a faint beeping sound filled the room. Nara stiffened, her hand darting to a small device on her belt. The beeping stopped as quickly as it had started, but her expression remained tense. What was that? Elias asked, his humor replaced by concern. Nothing of importance, she said, though her rigid posture said otherwise. Yeah, I'm not buying that, he said, crossing his arms. What's going on? Nara hesitated, her glowing eyes flicking to the window. It is a precaution, to ensure I am not followed. Followed? Elias repeated, his voice rising slightly. By who? She didn't answer, instead moving to the window and peering out into the storm. Her sudden shift from calm to alert set Elias on edge. Okay, you're going to have to give me more than that, he said, stepping closer. Who are you running from? Nara turned to him, her expression unreadable. It is better if you do not know. That's not exactly comforting, he said, his irritation growing. You show up out of nowhere, start talking about rewards and thermal shields, and now you're telling me you might have led someone here? What kind of trouble are you in? Her gaze softened, and for the first time Elias saw a flicker of vulnerability in her glowing eyes. The kind that is not easily escaped. Elias ran a hand through his hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. Great. Just great. You know, I was having a perfectly boring evening before you showed up. I did not intend to disrupt your life, she said quietly. Well, you did, he shot back, though there was no real anger in his voice. He sighed again, shaking his head. All right, fine. You don't want to tell me what's going on? That's your business. But if someone shows up looking for you, I'm not getting involved. Nara nodded, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. Understood. Elias watched her for a moment, his frustration giving way to a grudging sense of sympathy. Whatever she was caught up in, it was clear she didn't want to be. Look, he said, his tone softer. You can stay here until the storm lets up, but after that, you're on your own. Thank you, she said, inclining her head. Elias grumbled something under his breath and returned to his chair, picking up his mug of tea. As he sipped it, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life had just become a lot more complicated. The storm raged on through the night, battering the cabin with relentless fury. The howling wind seemed alive, its voice weaving through the crevices like a warning. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Elias sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the glowing embers, while Nara stood near the window, her posture rigid as she stared into the white abyss outside. He had tried to ignore her, focusing instead on a half-finished schematic spread across the table, but her presence was impossible to overlook. She was unnervingly still, as though she were part of the cabin itself, yet her energy filled the room. You're going to burn a hole in that window, Elias said, breaking the silence. Nara didn't turn. I am listening. To what? The storm. It is different here, she said, her voice distant. Elias frowned. Different how? It's just wind and snow. She glanced over her shoulder, her glowing eyes meeting his. It carries weight, meaning. Right, he said, dragging the word out. You're not going to start talking about mystical weather spirits, are you? Nara's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. Number. But storms have significance where I come from. They are rare, and when they occur, they are transformative. Elias leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Well, here, they're just a pain. Knock out the power, block the roads, and leave you stuck eating canned beans for a week. She tilted her head, studying him. You dismiss what you do not understand. And you're a little too comfortable being cryptic, he shot back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, and the wind screamed against the windows. Then, Nara turned fully to face him. "You are an inventor," she said, her tone shifting. "You create solutions to problems. Why?" Elias blinked at the abrupt change in topic. "Why? I don't know. Because I can. Because it's satisfying to fix things, I guess." "To fix things," she repeated, as though tasting the words. "Do you believe everything can be fixed?" He hesitated, her question catching him off guard. "Not everything," he admitted. "Some things are just broken." Nara's gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed almost vulnerable. "Where I come from, there is a saying, nothing is truly broken, only waiting to be remade." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Sounds nice. A little idealistic, though." "Perhaps," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. Before he could respond, a low hum filled the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down Elias's spine. Nara stiffened, her hand darting to the device on her belt. "What is that?" Elias asked, his voice sharp. "Trouble," she said, her glowing eyes narrowing. Elias shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "What kind of trouble?" Nara didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the window, her movement swift and purposeful. She pressed a hand against the glass, her expression tense. "They are near," she said, more to herself than to him. "Who's they?" Elias demanded, his frustration mounting. "You can't just keep dropping vague warnings and expect me to go along with it." Nara turned to him, her gaze intense. "You let me into your home. You are now part of this." "Part of what?" he asked, his voice rising. Before she could answer, the hum grew louder, resonating through the cabin like a low-frequency vibration. The lights flickered and the fire sputtered briefly before steadying. Elias grabbed a flashlight, his mind racing. "Okay, what's going on? Is this some kind of alien thing?" Nara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." His stomach dropped. "You're serious?" "I am," she said, her tone grave. Elias stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. "You're an alien?" "Yes," she said simply. "And those whatever's out there, they're looking for you?" "Yes." Elias ran a hand through his hair, letting out a string of muttered curses. "Great, just great. You know, I was fine with my boring, snowed-in life. Then you show up, and now I'm apparently in the middle of some intergalactic chase. Fantastic." "I did not choose this," Nara said, her voice quiet but firm. Elias sighed, his frustration ebbing slightly. "All right, fine. What do we do?" Nara's expression hardened. "We prepare." "Prepare for what?" Before she could answer, a sharp, metallic sound echoed outside, a distant screech that set Elias's teeth on edge. "For them," she said, her voice low. Elias grabbed a wrench from the table, his hands trembling slightly. "You're going to have to be a little more specific." "They are called Seekers," Nara said, moving to the center of the room. "They track, they hunt, and they do not stop." "Seekers," Elias repeated, his grip tightening on the wrench. "What do they want?" "Me," she said simply. "Why?" "That is not your concern," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Elias opened his mouth to protest, but the hum outside grew louder, cutting him off. Nara moved quickly, pulling a small device from her belt. It unfolded into a sleek, cylindrical object that pulsed with a faint blue light. "What is that?" he asked, his curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "A shield generator," she said, placing it on the floor. Elias watched as the device emitted a shimmering field that expanded to cover the cabin. The hum outside faltered, as though the storm itself had recoiled. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "That's impressive. But how long will it hold?" "As long as it needs to," Nara said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: his quiet life was over. The hum outside receded into the storm, leaving a tense, vibrating silence in its wake. The shield generator pulsed faintly in the middle of the room, its blue light casting strange, rippling patterns on the walls. Elias stood by the window, his wrench still clutched tightly in his hand, while Nara knelt beside the device, her fingers gliding over its surface with practiced precision. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. So, what happens now? Do we just wait? For the moment, Nara said without looking up. The shield will mask our presence, but it will not hold indefinitely. Elias frowned. How long is indefinitely? Long enough, if we are fortunate, she replied, her tone unreadable. Great, he muttered, pacing the room. So, we're sitting ducks in a glowing bubble, hoping these seekers don't find a way in. Fantastic plan. Nara's gaze flicked to him, her expression calm but firm. If you have a better plan, I am listening. Elias stopped pacing, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, well, I'm fresh out of ideas. Alien invasions aren't exactly my area of expertise. They are not invading, she said, her voice soft but pointed. Could have fooled me, he muttered under his breath. Nara didn't respond, turning her attention back to the shield generator. Her movements were precise, almost methodical, but there was a tension in her posture that Elias hadn't noticed before. She was worried, maybe even scared, and that realization did nothing to calm his nerves. He sank into his chair, letting out a long breath. All right, let's back up a second. You said these seekers are hunting you. Why? What did you do? Nara hesitated, her fingers pausing over the generator. It is not what I have done, she said finally. It is what I possess. Elias frowned. What you possess? Like an object? Yes. What kind of object? She stood slowly, her glowing eyes meeting his. An artifact. Ancient, powerful, and dangerous in the wrong hands. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Okay, and let me guess, these seekers are the wrong hands? They serve those who would use the artifact for destruction, she said, her voice tinged with regret. Of course they do, Elias muttered, leaning back in his chair. And you just happened to bring this artifact with you? I had no choice, she said, her tone defensive. If I left it behind, they would have found it. I am the only one who can protect it. Elias studied her, his mind racing. She was serious, deadly serious, and that terrified him more than anything else. He didn't know what this artifact was, or why it was so important, but it was clear that Nara believed she was the only thing standing between it and catastrophe. All right, he said after a long pause. Let's say I believe you. What's the plan? How do we get out of this? Nara's expression softened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of gratitude in her glowing eyes. We wait for the storm to pass. Then, I must find a way to leave this place without being tracked. And the artifact? It remains with me, she said firmly. Elias nodded slowly, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were in way over their heads. Okay, but if these seekers get through your shield, what then? Nara's gaze hardened. Then we fight. Fight? Elias repeated, his voice rising slightly. With what? A wrench and some canned beans? She tilted her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. You underestimate yourself. Elias let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly a hero, lady. I'm just a guy who fixes broken things. Perhaps that is exactly what is needed, she said quietly. Before he could respond, a sharp metallic screech echoed through the storm, louder and closer than before. Elias jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. What was that? They are testing the shield, Nara said, her voice calm but tense. Elias moved to the window, peering into the swirling snow. At first, he saw nothing but the storm's endless white fury. Then, a shadow moved, large, fluid, and unnervingly fast. There's something out there, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Nara said, stepping beside him. "A seeker drone." "A drone?" Elias repeated, his stomach twisting. "Like a machine?" "Partially," she said, her gaze fixed on the window. "They are biomechanical, part machine, part living organism. They are relentless and highly adaptive." "Great," he muttered, gripping the wrench tighter. The shadow moved again, circling the cabin. The screech came again, followed by a low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate in Elias's chest. "They are scanning the shield," Nara said, her voice low. "Looking for weaknesses. Will they find any?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. He was out of his depth, completely and utterly out of his depth, but he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. "All right," he said, turning to Nara. "What do we need to do to stop them?" Her gaze met his, and for a moment he thought she might argue, but then she nodded, her expression resolute. "There is a way to disrupt their signal. It will not destroy them, but it will buy us time." "Okay, what do you need?" She moved quickly, gathering a handful of components from her belt and placing them on the table. "These, combined with your tools, should suffice." Elias glanced at the strange devices, his mind already working to piece together a plan. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's get to work." As they worked side by side, the storm raged on, and the shadow outside continued its relentless circling. But for the first time, Elias felt a spark of hope. They might not be heroes, but together they had a chance. The storm had not relented. If anything, it seemed to grow angrier, its howling wind slamming against the cabin like a living thing intent on breaking through. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. Elias and Nara worked in tense silence, their movements synchronized as they pieced together the makeshift device that might buy them time against the Seekers. The table was a cluttered mess of alien components and Elias's tools, an unlikely fusion of advanced technology and good old-fashioned human ingenuity. Wires snaked across the surface, connecting glowing crystals to capacitors and circuit boards. "Pass me the soldering iron," Elias said, not looking up from his work. Nara handed it to him without a word, her glowing eyes focused on the delicate crystal she was holding. It pulsed faintly, its light shifting in rhythm with the storm outside. "What exactly does this thing do again?" Elias asked, his voice tight with concentration. "It disrupts their communication," Nara said, her tone clipped. "The Seekers are linked to a central intelligence. This will sever that link temporarily." "Temporarily," Elias echoed, not exactly comforting. "It is all we can manage with the resources at hand," she said, her voice softening slightly. Elias glanced at her, surprised by the hint of vulnerability in her tone. "All right," he said, nodding. "Let's hope it's enough." The device was nearly complete when the shield generator emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine. Nara's head snapped up, her posture instantly alert. "What's that?" Elias asked, his stomach tightening. "They are intensifying their scans," she said, her voice grim. "The shield is weakening." Elias cursed under his breath, his hands moving faster. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes," she said, already moving to the shield generator. "Minutes?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You couldn't have mentioned that earlier?" She shot him a look. "Would it have changed anything?" "Fair point," he muttered, returning his focus to the device. Nara knelt beside the shield generator, her fingers flying over its controls. The blue field flickered, its light dimming slightly before stabilizing. "I have reinforced it for now," she said, standing, "but it will not hold against a direct assault." "Good thing we're almost done," Elias said, tightening the last screw on the device. "All right, that should do it. How do we test this thing?" "We do not," Nara said, taking the device from him. "We use it." Elias blinked. "Just like that? No dry run? No, let's make sure this won't blow up in our faces?" "There is no time," she said, her expression resolute. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. What do you need me to do? Stay here, she said, heading for the door. Wait, what? He said, stepping in front of her. You're going out there? Alone? I am the one they are hunting, she said. It is my responsibility. Yeah, well, I'm the one who let you in, he said, his voice firm. So like it or not, I'm involved. You're not doing this by yourself. Nara hesitated, her gaze searching his. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of arguing, but then she nodded. Very well, but you must follow my lead. Deal, he said, grabbing his wrench. She raised an eyebrow. You are bringing that? Hey, it's gotten me this far, he said with a shrug. Nara's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. Very well. Let us hope you will not need it. The two of them stepped outside, the cold hitting them like a physical force. The wind screamed around them, whipping snow into their faces and obscuring their vision. The shield's blue glow was faint but visible, a fragile barrier between them and the storm. Where's the drone? Elias shouted over the wind. There, Nara said, pointing to a dark shape circling just beyond the shield's edge. Elias squinted, his heart pounding. The drone was larger than he'd expected, its sleek metallic body glinting faintly in the storm's light. It moved with an unsettling grace, its limbs, if they could be called that, shifting and extending as it scanned the shield. What now? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Nara held up the device. I will activate this. It will emit a pulse that disrupts their signal. Be ready to retreat. Got it, he said, gripping his wrench tighter. Nara pressed a series of buttons on the device, and it began to hum softly. The sound grew louder, rising in pitch until it was almost painful. The drone reacted instantly, its movements becoming erratic as it turned toward them. Now! Nara shouted, hurling the device toward the drone. The device hit the ground and exploded in a burst of light, sending out a shockwave that rippled through the storm. The drone let out a high-pitched screech, its body convulsing as the light enveloped it. Run! Nara yelled, grabbing Elias's arm. They sprinted back toward the cabin, the wind fighting them every step of the way. Behind them, the drone's screeches grew fainter, its movements sluggish and disjointed. They burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind them. Elias collapsed into a chair, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Did it work? He asked, looking at Nara. For now, she said, her expression grim. But they will adapt. They always do. Elias groaned, rubbing his temples. Of course they will, because nothing can ever be easy. Nara's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. You did well, she said quietly. He looked up at her, surprised by the warmth in her voice. Thanks, he said, managing a weak smile. The moment was short-lived. The shield generator let out another high-pitched whine, and the lights flickered. They are coming, Nara said, her voice tense. Elias grabbed his wrench, his heart sinking. Guess it's time for round 2. The storm outside had become an unrelenting wall of sound, the winds howling like some ancient, furious beast. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. The shield generator emitted an erratic hum, its light flickering like a dying flame. Elias paced the room, his wrench swinging loosely in his hand, while Nara worked furiously to stabilize the shield. They're not going to stop, are they? Elias asked, his voice tight. No, Nara said without looking up. The Seekers are relentless. They will not stop until they have what they seek. Elias stopped pacing, his stomach twisting. And if they get through? Nara hesitated, her fingers pausing over the generator's controls. Then we fight, she said finally. Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wasn't a soldier or a hero, just a guy who fixed things for a living. But as he looked at Nara, her glowing eyes filled with determination, he realized he didn't have a choice. All right, he said, gripping his wrench tighter. What's the plan? Nara straightened, her gaze meeting his. There is a cave system beneath this area, she said. If we can reach it, we may be able to lose them. A cave system? Elias repeated, frowning. How do you know that? She hesitated again, her expression unreadable. I studied this region before I arrived. It is why I chose this location. Elias raised an eyebrow. You planned this? Not exactly, she said, but I knew it might come to this. He shook his head, letting out a low whistle. You really don't do anything halfway, do you? Nara allowed herself a faint smile. It is not my way. All right, he said, nodding. So, how do we get to these caves? There is an entrance nearby, she said, but we must move quickly. The shield will not hold much longer. Elias glanced at the generator, which was now emitting a series of erratic beeps. Yeah, I can see that. Nara gathered her equipment, moving with practiced efficiency. She handed Elias a small device, a sleek metallic object that fit neatly in his palm. What's this? He asked, turning it over in his hand. A personal shield, she said. It will protect you for a short time if we are attacked. Elias raised an eyebrow. You've had this the whole time? It is a last resort, she said. And it is not foolproof. Use it wisely. Got it, he said, slipping the device into his pocket. Nara slung a small pack over her shoulder and nodded toward the door. Let's go. The two of them stepped outside, the storm hitting them like a physical force. The shield's blue glow was faint now, barely visible against the swirling snow. Which way? Elias shouted over the wind. This way, Nara said, leading him toward a cluster of rocks in the distance. They moved quickly, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The cold was biting, seeping through Elias's coat and chilling him to the bone. Are we close? He asked, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Almost, Nara said, her voice steady. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech pierced the air, sending a shiver down Elias's spine. He turned to see a dark shape emerging from the storm, a seeker drone, its sleek body glinting faintly in the dim light. Run! Nara shouted, grabbing his arm. They sprinted toward the rocks, the drone closing in behind them. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There! Nara said, pointing to a narrow opening in the rocks. They dove into the opening just as the drone fired a burst of energy, the blast narrowly missing them and scorching the ground. The cave was dark and cold, the air damp and heavy. Elias leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. That was too close, he said, his voice shaky. Nara nodded, her expression grim. They will not stop. We must keep moving. She activated a small device on her wrist, and a faint light illuminated the cave, casting long shadows on the walls. Stay close, she said, leading the way deeper into the cave. The passage was narrow and winding, the walls rough and uneven. The sound of dripping water echoed around them, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Are you sure this is the right way? Elias asked, his voice low. Yes, Nara said. The caves extend for miles. If we can reach the deeper chambers, we may be able to lose them. Elias nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. As they moved deeper into the cave, the air grew colder, and the walls began to glisten with ice. The faint light from Nara's device reflected off the ice, creating an otherworldly glow. This place is creepy, Elias muttered. It is beautiful, Nara said, her voice soft. Elias glanced at her, surprised by the wistful note in her tone. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her glowing eyes reflecting the icy light. What's on your mind? He asked. She hesitated, her expression unreadable. This place reminds me of home, she said finally. Your home had caves like this. No, she said, but it had beauty and silence. Elias nodded, unsure of what to say. He wanted to ask her more about her home, but the look on her face stopped him. They continued in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the cavern. The passage opened into a larger chamber, its ceiling arching high above them. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and a faint blue light seemed to emanate from the walls. What is this place? Elias asked, his voice hushed. I do not know, Nara said, her gaze sweeping the chamber. But it is ancient. Elias shivered, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the eerie atmosphere. Suddenly, a low hum filled the chamber, growing louder with each passing second. Nara's eyes widened, and she grabbed Elias's arm. They have found us, she said, her voice urgent. Elias turned to see another drone emerging from the shadows, its sleek body glinting in the faint light. Great, he muttered, gripping his wrench. What now? Nara's expression hardened. We fight. The cavern hummed with an ominous energy as the seeker drone advanced, its sleek body reflecting the faint bluish light from the walls. The air was thick with tension, the low hum of the drone blending with the faint dripping of water from the stalactites above. Elias tightened his grip on the wrench in his hand, his heart pounding so loudly it nearly drowned out the sound. Nara stepped forward, her posture firm and resolute. Her glowing eyes locked onto the drone, and her voice was calm yet commanding. Stay behind me, Elias. Not a chance, he said, moving to her side. I didn't come all this way to cower in the background. The drone emitted a sharp, high-pitched screech, its movements erratic as it scanned the chamber. Nara's earlier disruption device had clearly done some damage, but it hadn't been enough to stop it entirely. We need to disable it completely, Nara said, her gaze darting to the walls of the chamber. There may be something here we can use. Elias followed her gaze, his eyes landing on a series of glowing crystals embedded in the walls. They pulsed faintly, their light shifting in rhythm with the hum of the drone. Those crystals, he said, pointing. What are they? They are energy conduits, Nara said, her voice tinged with awe. They are ancient, but their power is still active. Elias's mind raced. Can we use them to overload the drone? Nara nodded, her expression thoughtful. It is possible. If we can channel their energy, it might be enough to destroy the drone. All right, Elias said, his resolve firming. Tell me what to do. Nara moved quickly, pulling a small device from her pack. She attached it to one of the crystals, her fingers flying over its controls. This will create a surge, she explained, but we must lure the drone closer to the crystal for it to be effective. Elias glanced at the drone, which was hovering near the center of the chamber. Guess that's my job, he said, gripping his wrench. Elias, no, Nara said, her voice sharp. It is too dangerous. He gave her a small, lopsided smile. Danger seems to be my thing lately. Before she could protest further, Elias stepped into the open, waving his wrench to draw the drone's attention. Hey, over here, he shouted. The drone's head swiveled toward him, its movements jerky but deliberate. It let out another screech, its limbs extending as it advanced. Come on, you oversized tin can, Elias muttered under his breath, backing toward the crystal. Nara worked quickly, her hands a blur as she adjusted the device. Just a little closer, she murmured. The drone was almost within range when it suddenly paused, its head tilting as if sensing the trap. Now, Nara! Elias shouted. She activated the device, and the crystal flared brightly, sending out a pulse of energy that rippled through the chamber. The drone let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing as the energy surged through it. Elias shielded his eyes from the blinding light, his ears ringing from the sound. When he looked up, the drone was motionless, its body charred and smoking. Is it dead? He asked, his voice shaky. Nara approached the drone cautiously, her eyes scanning its remains. After a moment, she nodded. It is disabled. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. Thank God! But Nara's expression remained tense. This was only a scout, she said. The others will not be far behind. Elias groaned. Of course they won't. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. You were brave, Elias, but we must keep moving. They continued deeper into the cave, the air growing colder and the walls narrowing around them. Nara's pace was steady, her determination unshaken despite the danger. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast, open chamber. In the center stood a massive structure, a towering obelisk of glowing crystal that seemed to hum with a life of its own. "What is this?" Elias asked, his voice filled with awe. "It is a sanctuary," Nara said, her voice reverent. "A place of refuge and power." The obelisk pulsed faintly, its light filling the chamber with a soothing glow. Nara approached it slowly, her hand outstretched. "This is what they seek," she said. "It is the heart of this world." Elias frowned. "If they get their hands on it—" "They will not," Nara said firmly. She placed her hand on the obelisk, and the light intensified, enveloping her in a radiant glow. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and Elias took a step back, his heart racing. "Nara, what are you doing?" he asked. "Ending this," she said, her voice calm. The light grew brighter and Elias shielded his eyes. When it faded, Nara stood before him, her expression serene. "It is done," she said. "What's done?" he asked, confused. "I have activated the sanctuary's defenses," she said. "The Seekers will no longer be able to approach this place." Elias let out a shaky laugh. "You could have led with that?" She smiled faintly. "It required a great deal of energy. I was not certain it would work." "Well, I'm glad it did," he said, his voice filled with relief. And they returned to the cabin the next day, the storm finally abating. The air was crisp and clear, the landscape blanketed in a pristine layer of snow. Elias stood on the porch, looking out at the horizon. "So, what now?" he asked. Nara joined him, her expression thoughtful. "Now, I must ensure that the sanctuary remains protected." "And me?" She turned to him, her glowing eyes soft. "That is up to you, Elias. But you have proven yourself to be far more than you believed." He smiled, a sense of pride welling up in his chest. "Guess I'll stick around for a while. Someone's got to make sure you don't get into too much trouble." Nara's lips twitched in amusement. "Very well. I welcome your company." As the sun rose over the snowy landscape, Elias felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The storm was over, but his journey with Nara was just beginning,